Hello, and welcome to this session about calculating the ROI of test automation. My name is Mark Lambert, and I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Parasoft. And what I'm going to talk about today is the things you need to consider as you build your test automation practice and how to calculate and communicate the ROI of that test automation practice. Now, before we jump into that, though, we should really be asking ourselves, how critical is quality to your organization? And the reason being is that really this is what's going to underpin your whole initiative. And really, we have to recognize there is still a lot of poor software quality out in the industry. The recent Siskiyou report actually estimates the total cost of poor software quality is over $2 trillion, which is over 10% of the US GDP. So this is significant. And actually, it's also so important that many organizations are starting to address that as part of their annual reports and investor conferences. So Walmart, United Healthcare, CVS Health, all have talked about how software quality is critical for them to be able to deliver innovations to their customer base and for them to be able to succeed within the market. And this is the same with our case study for today, which is Caesars Entertainment. Caesars Entertainment is the largest casino operator in the US. In 2020, they merged with Eldorado, and you might recognize a number of these brands, but not realize that they're all under the Caesars umbrella. Now, obviously, in this industry, guest experience is their number one priority, but this organization didn't happen overnight. It's grown through acquisition over many years, and there are many systems in play within each of these different entities. This leads to challenges for Caesars as they are wanting to provide a common and consistent guest experience across all of the reservations, loyalty programs, everywhere where they touch a guest client, being able to have ultimately a guest experience which is common, consistent, and fully integrated. Now, a manual testing approach doesn't scale. It can't keep pace with the delivery of the innovation. It also is going to miss things as well. So what happens is you end up seeing the side effects of projects being delayed, project schedules being delayed, issues being found in production, either quality or performance related issues. And 6 years ago, Caesars went on a journey, and that journey was to really start putting in place a quality process and test automation so that they could efficiently deliver high quality guest experiences. And we're going to talk about that journey, and we're going to talk about how they calculate the ROI of that to communicate the value to the executive stakeholders. But before we jump into that, we need to think about what and how do we structure our test automation strategy? What are the things that we need to do? Where do we need to focus so that we can deliver that ROI? And the first thing to focus on and the first thing to think about is what applications are we going to test? What use cases are we going to test? And we want to target the ones that have the highest ROI and the biggest benefit, business benefit. And these are the ones where you have high utilization and low reliability. The problem children. Everybody has these within their organization. The ones where you know that when the application is being released, you're worried that it's going to have some undiscovered problems that are out there in production. This is where we want to focus. Now, we are going to be focusing as we grow with our adoption of test automation. We are going to be focused on broader test coverage, making sure we're covering all of the use cases, building in a border regression. And we are going to be covering the use cases where the applications are more reliable, or maybe they're not as frequently utilized. But we want to address those subsequently. Let's focus on the areas where we're going to have the highest business impact. We then need to say, okay, how are we going to test and validate those? And this is where we do a trade-off between a manual testing practice and an automated testing practice. Both of them have pros and cons. So manual doesn't have an upfront cost. It's easy to maintain because really the definition of what we're going to do for manual testing is built into our requirements definition process and should be built into our regular agile workflows. It's also a great way of uncovering usability issues within an application. Your domain experts are really going to know not only does a use case work, but does it work to achieve the end goal, to achieve the goal that you're trying to deliver to the clients? So manual testing, especially in the world of exploratory testing, is really essential as part of your overall testing strategy, but it's expensive. You don't have the upfront cost, but you have an ongoing cost. It takes time to do. So, and this is where automation can come in. So automation, yes, it has an upfront cost because you have to create the test automation script and you have to create it in such a way that it's reliable and maintainable. We'll touch upon that again at the end. Now, when those tests are created, you can fully automate them. You can do accurate and efficient testing of your use cases. Another area where automated is better than manual is that when you're looking at the same problem over and over again, as a human, we can miss things and we can make mistakes. A machine is going to do what you just told it to do. So whereas a human can identify, does this functionality meet the business need, and a machine can't, a machine can test and verify that the same numbers are in the same places each time. So the key thing is, it's not one or the other. You actually need a blend of both, and you need a blend of different types of testing practice. So how do I structure my testing strategy, and how do I build a scalable testing strategy that I can deploy within the organization? Now, this is where the testing pyramid comes in. Very popular within Agile community. Martin Fowler, Michael Cohen are two big proponents of this. And in essence, what we're saying is you want to organize your testing portfolio, all of your tests, such that you have very broad coverage from the granular or lower level testing practices. So unit testing, for example, you should have a lot of unit tests that are deployed as part of the developer's workflow, integrated into the CI platform so that they're being executed on every commit. The reason why you want to do these is you want to keep them isolated and close to the code. This means they're going to be quick to run, they're going to be quick to diagnose, and quick to identify regressions that are introduced into the code base. Now, because they're typically very isolated, though, they're not taking into account the business functionality or the end-to-end workflows. So this is when we start moving up the layers of the testing pyramid. The first layer would be API testing. And this is where we're testing services, typically at the message layer, like RESTful services over HTTP. This is a really good way of starting to test your business logic, being able to test the flow across different API calls, but do it in an isolation way so that you can test individual business components of an overall application. It's very efficient from the point of view of time to execute. It's efficient from the point of view of time to diagnose as well. As we move up the testing pyramid, this is where things started getting more complicated. Now we're starting to bring the user interface into account. We probably need more of the testing infrastructure or more of the application infrastructure in place. But it is a pyramid, it's not a trapezoid. So what we want to do is we want to minimize the amount of complex and time-consuming UI-centric testing practices, but we want to focus them into critical areas where they can provide us truly end-to-end integration testing. Now, you also want to consider that these type of tests are typically done later in the development cycle. So feedback from these is often a little bit later than when after the developers have submitted the code. So the time to remediate can be longer, and also it's harder to often debug and diagnose a complex end-to-end scenario, which is why those lower level tests in the pyramid are so valuable. Now, you can't, though, test quality into an application. You have to build this testing strategy on top of a solid foundation. And this is where deep code analysis comes in. Here, what we're going to be doing is focusing on the reliability and security issues within the application, going kind of beyond kind of the typical linting technologies, which would look at maintainability, readability of a code base, and really trying to uncover those deep reliability and security issues. This means you'll now have a solid quality base to build upon, and your testing practice is no longer trying to test quality, it's trying to test and verify functionality. So by doing this and deploying this model, you have something which is easier to scale, easier to automate. But however, when I talk to many organizations about their testing practices, they more relate to an ice cream cone or an inverted testing pyramid. This is because many times organizations take a UI-centric approach, and the front end is typically easier to understand. It's quick to define. It's easy to figure out how to use the application. But as we talked about before, maintenance of that becomes a challenge because as I'm trying to maintain my UI automation, this is actually one of the areas where you can end up spending a lot of time fixing and repairing your tests. Now, as I move down my pyramid, the automation runs quicker. I don't have to have the full infrastructure up and running. I don't have to have browsers. I don't have to have all my backend components plugged together. But the technical expertise required to be able to do that level of test automation increases. This is where your choice of technology and your choice of practices can really help you. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But one of the things that we also know from talking with clients is that many clients, as they're trying to approach a test automation strategy, and we talked about where they are on that journey, many organizations struggle with that API testing component. And this really is a sweet spot in the testing pyramid, because I can really transition and straddle the functional behavior with the lower level testing practices. So here, this is again something where technology can help, but also really where enabling and empowering your team is going to really help you build that scalable platform or that scalable practice moving forward. So given that I've got these different techniques and things that I need to consider, how do I now define the practice of test automation so that I can be successful with my quality-driven initiatives? So there are really three things that we need to focus on. First of all, you need to invest in people. Automation doesn't mean no people. It means investing in people, training those that could become test automation engineers, those which are comfortable with scripting, training them around test automation practices, maybe augmenting your team with automation specialists that can be used to kind of move around your organization to help you define the processes and practices so that you can have a common approach to test automation within the organization. The reason why you want these in place is you want to make sure that your testing practices and the goals of testing are aligned with your quality and business goals. If you don't align them, then you'll find that your ROI will be inconsistent between different groups. Another thing that's going to result in your ROI being inconsistent is if you have inconsistent metrics and reporting. These are going to be critical for you to be able to demonstrate the success of test automation as you start moving across the organization as a whole. And then lastly, it's the technology. You don't want to put technology at the beginning of the process. And actually, that's one of the challenges that a lot of organizations will face, is by putting technology at the beginning. What ends up happening is you end up with a very fragmented tool chain where many people develop silos of knowledge within the organization, which means you don't have as much flexibility with how you structure your organization and how the different teams are able to collaborate across from each other. So typically what you want to do is actually consolidate your technology. Many organizations I see will pick an open source tool or framework of choice, and then a third-party vendor driven solution, which is going to address the limitations of that open source framework or address other areas that open source framework doesn't actually address, given the longer term objectives of the organization. Because this is actually a key component as well. You need to consider what is your long-term objective. What are the things that you're going to need 2, 3, 4 years down the line, not just what your immediate needs are. And this is, again, where tool selection is very key and very important to align that with your long-term objectives, not just your short-term needs. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. And actually, with Caesars, this was actually a 6-year journey. And it started by defining a centralized team that would be the testing center of excellence, building quality into the culture of the organization. Then as the organization starts developing or started developing a quality culture, they're then able to start standardizing and stabilizing the practices across the different teams, operationalizing those best practices and starting to now disseminate testing into the teams rather than having it as a siloed service, having it as a set of teams or set of members that are embedded within the different projects and are able to work side by side with the development teams. By having the tool consolidation, it means they can scale up and scale down the projects without having to retrain engineers, without having to bring new team members on board. Years 4 and 5 is now we're starting to standardize and we're starting to optimize that, as I was just describing. And then year 6 is really where Caesars started seeing a massive acceleration on ROI that we'll talk about in a second. as that test automation started getting integrated into the CI/CD pipeline, as they started taking advantage of concepts like continuous testing and really making test automation front of mind into the organization as a whole. Moving forward, what Caesars are doing now is they're now starting to evaluate embedding service virtualization concepts into different teams, where I can leverage simulations of constrained components of my test environment to stabilize the test environment, to be able to address situations where I don't have available backend components or they're not controllable, so that I can really truly make testing continuous and doing it at any time as part of the development process. So how, that's a long journey, right? It was 6 years. How do you measure the ROI and communicate the ROI? Because it is an ongoing investment and you want to make sure that you're able to demonstrate that investment, both the end goal, but also track towards that end goal. So here's the formula that Caesars leverage. What Caesars were doing is leveraging their cost avoidance model associated with the savings from the automation itself. So here what we can say is taking the amount of time that it takes to perform manual testing activity and subtracting the amount of time that it takes to do that in an automated manner. So for example, in this scenario here, 31 hours to do manual testing, 1 hour to do the test execution, at $50 an hour gives us a cost avoidance of $1,500. Now, obviously, when I build that test automation the first time, there's an upfront cost, so we need to reduce that from our first frequency, so it's $1,250. Now, in itself, that's not a lot, right? It's just one run of the use case. But that run doesn't run just once. You're running that every week. So in this case, you now can start scaling that over an annual savings of $7,800 minus the cost of delivery, which is hardware, software, burn rate, things like that, or burden rate. So what can I do here, or what really happened at Caesars over that journey? Well, this is actually the cost avoidance that they saw. So in year one, $22,500. Not a massive number in itself, but over the 6 years, it adds up pretty significantly. And again, at that year 6, a big boost in the ROI calculation. So year 6, over $1 million saving just in that year. Over those total 6 years, over $2 million. And again, as they move forward addressing service virtualization or implementing service virtualization, the anticipation is an increase even further, going well above those that savings of $1 million a year. Another approach to cost reduction and ROI is actually through the earlier identification of defects. So some of you might be familiar with this this chart here. This comes from research that Capper-Jones did in '96 and then did again in 2017 around the cost of quality. And basically what we're saying here is the later that you identify a defect in the software development pipeline, the higher the cost of that defect is in remediation time. If we can actually move those defect identifications earlier, obviously we're going to reduce the cost associated with them. So how does that look like in the real world? So this was, again, another case study. This is actually a healthcare provider. And what we did here is where I applying the research, and I provide the references here, to identify if we find the problem earlier in the stage, what's the cost savings versus if we would have found it in the subsequent stage. So for example, the amount of effort to remediate an issue found in unit testing is 4 hours. That equates to, using our same $50 an hour, to $200. The cost avoidance there is the savings that I've got because I found it in unit testing versus finding it in SIT. So that's 450 minus the 200, which gives me $250. Now, really, it's worthwhile pointing out that this is actually a relatively conservative calculation. If I was to take a different situation and say, look, maybe I find a problem in SIT, which is costing me $450, that I would have previously found in production, which would have cost me $9,600, my savings is actually over $9,000. However, this conservative calculation gives me the ability to really have a good foundation. So as I go through the adoption of my test automation, not only am I tracking the time that I'm saving through automation, but I'm also tracking where the defects were identified and then saying, well, if I figure out that I'm finding them one stage earlier, here's the savings that I'm getting on top of that automation savings around the earlier defect detection. So let's wrap up with a few key considerations. First of all, you're going to need leadership support. This is not something that you can just bootstrap into an organization. It has to have leadership support because there's going to be cultural change. The change from or the change towards a quality first culture is the key for success for making sure that you can get the ROI of your test automation, which is ultimately a higher quality product coming out of the door. To be able to get that leadership support and maintain it over the period of time when you're going to be investing, you're going to need quantifiable ROI. I've given you 2 metrics today. There are others out there. What I would say is figure out which ones are going to work best for your organization. As I said, in this particular case, you could use both of these cost avoidance metrics together to actually give you an overarching cost avoidance number. Also, make sure that your business partners are strategically aligned with your objectives. Both your services partners, if you're doing staff augmentation or managed service deliveries, but also your technology partners as well. You want to make sure that your technology choices are there for you for the long term, that they're going to satisfy your needs in the long term, but also that they're going to be able to react to any changes in the industry, changes in methodologies, changes in kind of the technology that you're going to be using. And then lastly, don't forget about ongoing maintenance. We talked a little bit about the cost it takes to create a test, but we didn't really talk too much about the cost that it takes to maintain the tests. Look for technologies that can help you with that test maintenance challenge. Certainly at Parasoft, that's one of the key things that we do within our functional test automation suite. It's all about how do we reduce the technical complexity, reduce the burden of figuring out how different things are being used, but also how do we maintain those tests moving forward, because that really is the hidden cost of test automation. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. If you'd like to know some more, Cesar's actually presented exactly this case study at our Automated Software Testing and Quality Summit. You can use the QR code here to get access to that summit. There's other clients such as Fitch Solutions talking about how they reduced their production outages. There's Sabre Holdings and Alaska Airlines, as well as a keynote from Forrester analyst Diego. So that's a great resource. And then if you wanted to actually read up on the Cesar's case study, there's actually a case study here as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And if you would like to learn more about Parasoft's technologies, please reach out to us via the URL above.